Perfect. Okay, so in today's video lab, we're actually going to move from the front end and start exploring our back end. So in today's lab, we're going to actually build our own web server. We've learned a lot about web clients, and we've seen in the last couple of labs how web clients can actually request information from web servers, specific information, but all web servers at least deliver HTML documents to the web client, to the web browser. So recall that the technologies that we're going to predominantly be learning on top of the basic technologies, which has been HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, are going to be Node, Express, Mongo, and React. And so we're really going to explore the first of those technologies today. So there are companion lectures that will go into the basics of Node and the core modules for Node, and also the basics of NPM. So I would implore you to go and watch those alongside this lab so you can become more familiar with what we're going to be doing. But effectively, you can think of Node as a runtime environment for JavaScript that runs on top of the OS that you can go ahead and invoke from a bash terminal, as opposed to having it be contained inside of a browser environment. So this allows us to open up a whole lot of opportunities. It allows us to start producing applications in a very general purpose way that aren't just designed to run inside of a browser, but can run as its own self-contained entity. And so now we can start building like HTTP daemons to listen for a request and actually send a response, or we could actually build any kind of application we want, similar to Python or Java or anything else. So you could think of Node as the equivalent of like Java C and Java, or as Python that you can access from the terminal. So, and in fact, just to show you, if I go right into my terminal here and type in node-v, right, I can actually go ahead and effectively launch the Node application. It's essentially a terminal application. And so I can feed it JavaScript source code files, and it can parse it and execute it for me. And so NPM stands for Node Package Manager. We're going to take a look at that. So let's take a look at our table of contents. This is a relatively short lab. So you can see we're going to do an introduction where we're going to define what is a web server, what is Node, what is NPM. Then we're going to have 8 different iterations over the course of building from scratch a web server, so we can actually see what all the considerations that goes into a web server. And so the first iteration will just build a web server deployed with Node that's a hello world, so as basic as it gets. And then we'll go ahead and deploy, instead of with Node, with NPM, our Node Package Manager. Then once we learn how to use NPM, we'll go ahead and actually take the HTML file name from the URL paths and learn how to parse paths and start actually working with the file system from Node. Then we're going to start learning a little bit about these status codes that web servers will issue back to the client. We'll learn about 400 errors, or 404. We'll learn about 200, which is a success. We'll learn about how to serve HTML files to the browser, and then how to do redirect. So that's 300, status code 300, so that if it is a directory, we can set redirect to a file. And then we'll learn a little bit about status code 500, which is a server-side error as opposed to a browser-side error or client-side error. And then we'll just have some concluding notes. So relatively short lab today. So in terms of the introduction, the prereqs, there's none here, right? As long as you have Node installed, so make sure that you install Node. There's a number of ways to do it. I'm not going to go into the details because I already have it installed. As of today, the current version is 17.8. I had just updated it earlier today. But if you're watching this video in the future and it's a later version, that's completely fine. The motivation for today's lab is we're going to understand how a web server listens for and then responds back to a browser. I'm saying browser, but really any client's HTTP request. And of course, our goal is we're going to build a simple bare bone web server application in JavaScript that runs in Node from our Bash terminal. And so that way we can understand all the considerations that go into building a very simple web server. And then once we learn how to do this, we'll migrate to Express, which will do a lot of this heavy lifting for us so that we don't have to really be worried about building this from the ground up any longer. Our learning objectives is we're going to learn how to use Node and NPM. We're going to learn a little bit more about HTTP, but from the server side. And in that capacity, we need to learn a little bit about what MIME types are. And then these HTTP codes, I call them error codes, but they're not always referencing something that went wrong, right? It's more of a status code, but we will learn some of the error-related status codes that are there. And then also we'll learn our routes, or what we've been calling endpoints, really, from the client perspective. Okay, so a quick server-side architecture for our project is we will start the project by making a project folder where all of our assets and scripts will be organized. So this is relatively simple. Since we're building a server, we're just going to need a server.js file inside of a folder we'll call web server. Notice there's no data that we have to go ahead and download, so we can just build this right from scratch. So here, let me do this. So let's see here. Let's toggle over here. So here we have where our labs traditionally go. I will create a new folder that I will call web server. Perfect. Okay, now that I have a web server, let's see here. Yep, let's go into my web server. Okay, and now let's make a server.js file. Okay, so inside of web server, I should now have a server.js file. Perfect. Actually, let's get that loaded into the IDE so that we can go ahead and start editing that as we need to. Excellent. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the concepts that are worth mentioning. First, NPM, again, short for Node Package Manager. You can think of this as the package manager for your Node packages. So very explanatory name there. Effectively, what it does is it installs your Node dependencies and it can launch your Node apps. So Node.js, we can think of as a JavaScript runtime environment, which allows us to run JavaScript on the server side, so from the OS, without having to open up a web client or web browser. So some of the advantages of Node is it has built-in packages. So Node includes several modules that provide functionality for things like HTTP servers, file systems, WebSockets, cryptography, and much more. You can go to the API right here, and you can see all of the built-in functionality. So again, just like we were using MDN prior for learning how to go ahead and do everything in the client, it would behoove you, whenever you have any questions or doubts or considerations of what it is you want to do inside of the Node runtime environment, is to go seek out the API and evaluate what objects are in there, what classes are in there, and what methods are associated with those classes and objects. And we're going to explore a little bit of that in today's lab. Where you should also know that Node is asynchronous and it's event-driven. So all of our APIs of Node library are asynchronous and non-blocking. That allows for easy requests to external backend services before sending a response. And so again, understand that Node's architecture is single-threaded, but the way it manages the ability to not block, since it's on a single thread, is to use an event-driven system. So effectively what that means is that you have the event dispatcher, and whenever something gets registered in the event dispatcher, right, it's registered with the callback function, and as events occur, like say, for instance, promises become resolved, so a resolve event might get pushed into the event dispatcher, then any callback function that's bound to that promise, for instance, is then executed. So it's effectively a very intelligent way of handling multi-threaded like implementations on a single thread. And this way you don't have the complexity that can sometimes happen in multi-threaded applications where you have to worry about syncs and locks. Another Nice thing about Node is, well, the terminal support, right? We can launch our JavaScript applications right from the terminal with Node. So some other good concepts that are worth mentioning before we start is, well, we're going to actually be building the web server. So technically, we are now on backend services. And a web server is an application that listens for client HTTP requests and then sends back a response, an HTTP response. And of course, if you want additional information about how the HTTP cycle is, I've produced some documentation here that gives a quick overview that if you just want the additional information, this is a great resource here that MDM support that MDM has in terms of what is the client, what is the role and responsibilities of the web server, and what is effectively the protocol of HTTP. So if you have any lingering questions regarding HTTP, this is the place that I will direct you. The big takeaways is that on our web server, we're going to have routes. So routes refer to how an application's endpoints, or what we'll call URIs, respond to client requests. We have MIME types, and a MIME type is a media type, also known as a multi-purpose internet mail extension. And it's essentially the standard that indicates the nature of end format of a document that's being sent from the web server or being requested from the web client to the web server, and the web server can go ahead and deliver it. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the associated link that I have here. So when we get into actually defining our MIME types, you're going to see effectively we're going to examine the extension of the file that's being requested from the web server so that we know how to parse it and then send it to the client. And these might be things like fonts or images or text or videos. Sometimes they could be multi-part, so it could be like a message or form data. Sometimes it might be so here we have like text/CSS would be how we request a CSS style sheet, or how we request an HTML document or a JavaScript document. And images might be things like GIFs or JPEGs or PNGs. Audio might be things like, these look like our various videos. So like WebM, form data, and you could just see all the different ways that we can go as effectively have data encoding. So we have to be considerate of that when we're building out our web server. And then, of course, also a status code. So the MIME type gives us context about the documents being requested from us, and then the status codes are what we send back in terms of how successful or not we were in fulfilling that request. So every HTTP response has a status code associated with it to indicate whether a specific HTTP request had been successfully completed, or if not, like what could have been the issue. So typically, you don't usually see a lot of status codes between 100 to 199. Those are typically informational responses. This is a really popular one. Those successful responses are usually encoded as 200. And in fact, it could be coded as anything between 200 to 299. Redirect responses are typically those responses that cause the client to redirect to some other location. We'll actually implement a redirect inside this lab. And then errors can either happen when sending a request and not being able to resolve a response satisfactory, either because of an issue on the client side. And if that's the case, it's a 400 to 499 error status code. And if it's a server end error, then it's usually error code 500, but it could be anywhere between 500 to 599. So again, these will help you debug things as you encounter them, as you build out your web applications. And if you want to learn more, again, I give you that link, and you can see what all the individual status codes are in between. And again, the companion lecture, I think, goes into greater detail for all of this. Okay, now with that said, we've covered all the basic information we need to know. Let's actually start building a web server. So the first thing I want to do, my first goal will be, well, a simple web server that gives a hello world response deployed with Node. So our approach is, well, we'll make a web server that listens for HTTP requests and from a port and sends back a response. So in our first step, we'll have to go ahead and create that server.js file, which I've already done. Excellent. So I'm going to import a module, the HTTP module. So the HTTP module is one of the core modules that's pre-built into Node, and that will help us go ahead with all of the responsibilities and roles for handling requests and responses. So we're going to import, let me grab this. So let me go to my server. And so I'm going to go ahead and you'll see I'm putting require HTTP. So require is a mechanism that allows us to import a module in Node. So require is, so there's a little bit different syntax when I originally wrote this lab. Now, if I'm not mistaken, let me see something really quick. I believe that Node might actually support the same kind of imports that the client does. Let's see, Node 17, let me see. This was one of the things that was a, let's see here. Oh, yeah. Oh, excellent, yeah. So let's try this out. Let's try this newer implementation style out. So we'll try the same import mechanism that we can do in the browser inside of our Node code as well. Well, I'll keep this and then we'll refactor is what we'll do. But this was the classical way that we would normally have to import modules. But it's my understanding that the newest version of Node has actually been updated to be in line with importing modules the same way it happens on the client side. So we'll do a refactor of this afterwards so we can see the two variant approaches. Oh, let me go through the code too. So here, we're going to import from the HTTP module, and we're going to just name that object that gets returned to us HTTP. Then we're going to set up a host name. So our host name could either be localhost, or it could be the IP address of localhost, which is 127.0.0.1. And then we're going to listen on port 3000. So this is just configuration information for me to be able to start listening from the outside world, right, on a port for some requests that are going to come in from localhost, from this host name and this port. Okay, so the second thing I want to do is, now that I've set up the basic information, basic data I'm going to need to actually start listening for requests, I'm going to define a callback function that's going to handle HTTP requests that are being made. So again, this is going to be a callback function that the server invokes when it receives an HTTP request. The server passes the request object and an empty response object into the function. And then what's going to happen is we're going to fill out the response object over the life cycle of this HTTP handle, over the life cycle of this callback function. Okay. So let's go here. And let's go ahead and create this HTTP handler. And again, there's two things that'll be passed in: the actual request that will have like the request, the HTTP verb, like what type of request, whether it's a GET or PUT or whatever. It'll have a request header and it'll have a request body potentially. But this is what we're going to be filling out over the course of this. So what we're going to fill out inside of our handler is we're going to give it a status code. And we're going to initialize with a status code of 200 to say it was a success. We successfully gave a response to the request. And then we're going to set a header inside of a response to say what content type we're going to deliver back to the client. And so when we set a header, this is a key value pair. So the key is going to be content type. And then the value, this is essentially defined as a MIME type here. That's going to be text. So that's like the super category, and the type of text is just going to be plain text. And then after that, we have to end the response. Otherwise, we're going to leave the client hanging. So we need to end the response. And when we end the response, we're going to send data that we're going to end it with. So we're going to send back to the client, hello world, as a new line character. And then when this end occurs, then we're going to shut down that connection, and this will get delivered to the client side. Okay. Now for step 3, we're going to also just create a server message. The server message is going to be a callback function such that when we start listening when we launch our server to start listening on that port and that host name, we're going to immediately invoke this message just to let us know that our application successfully started. So this is just going to be a function that's going to do a console log for us. So here, let me do that. So here, server message, it's just console logs, server running at, and then we're going to put the host name and the port. And then the last thing we're going to do in this step is we're going to actually have to create something that launches or creates a server for us and then has the server start to listen. And so again, this is when we're going to use that HTTP module that we were talking about, where it allows us to create a server. So we'll actually look at the API in a moment, but this is just 2 lines of code, really. So here we're going to create a server object. And we were going to do that by requesting from the HTTP module to create server with the configurations that we are with the configurations that we're going to have set up. So effectively, when we create our server, the first thing we have to do is give it the callback function that's going to handle the requests and responses. So when the server is listening to a host name and a port, when it actually gets a request, it's going to send the request here into this method, right? Because we're passing it a reference of this method. And then it's also going to pass it a response object, but it's not going to have any data. It's the role of our callback method to actually populate a response. And then once we've actually given it the callback function here, then we can say, okay, the server has now been created, it has a listen method. And when we tell it to start listening, we can tell it on what port to listen to and what host name to listen to. So we're going to listen on port 3000, and we're going to listen on port localhost here. So the nice thing about this is understand you can have multiple servers at one time listening on different ports and hit them up and get different data from each of those servers. And then the third parameter we're passing here is this callback function that will just go ahead and execute when the server starts listening. That will be the console log there. So relatively simple code here. And again, if at any time we want to know what was really going on, we can go to the API and we can look up, not that, and not that. So if we wanted to see here, HTTP, yep, this is where we go here. And then I could see, if I wanted to, I could see, oh, what does it mean for server to listen? What does it mean to create a server? So here, let's go to server listen, because that's what we're doing. And we could see that this indicates whether or not is listening. Here you go. Starts the HTTP server listening for connections. So very obvious by its naming, but again, I want you to get used to being able to peruse the API. And if there's any questions about what this code does, you can see it. You could easily find it here. Let's see here. Where am I here? HTTP, create. Oh, I guess I should spell that right. And here, if I want to see what create server does, I can see right here that it's going to take in my options and then a request listener, and that's when I'm passing it, and it's going to return back a server instance. So it's going to construct that server with the configurations that I give it. So again, all of the code you see here, if it's not something that you're familiar with, check the API. Okay, so now that we have that, we can go ahead and let me make sure that's saved. Okay, yep, I see that looks saved. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch that using Node. I'm going to launch that directly with Node, and then we're going to update to use npm afterwards. So here we go. We got our server running that message. Actually, let me, yeah, this is perfect. Actually, let me launch it from the terminal here. Let me expand that out some so it's nice and big. That way I can what was it called? Server.j. First of all, where am I? I think I need to go into my web server. Okay, perfect. And okay, so I see now I get this runtime message server running at, and that's local address, and that's the port. And so if I go and try to go there, you'll see, oh, I actually got that response back and it's hello world, right? From this callback function here. Now, if I forget to end that response, watch what happens. Let me save that. Let me kill the server. Let me rerun the server. And and here, you'll see, it's just, let me actually open it up in another tab even, so you can see it's not giving me the hello world at all, right? It's going to just look like it's perpetually trying to load. And that's because I sent a request and my server isn't implemented to actually end with a response. So it's keeping the connection open until the server sends back a response. If we don't end the response, this is the behavior you're going to get, what appears to be just a perpetual loading. Now, let me also. Oh, weird. Thought that. Okay.
Does that loading ever end, or does it just keep going and going? Like if somebody had a web page that did that.
Get that to be a little bit smaller there. Okay, so let's move on. Let's close that and let's get that working again. So let's get this back here. Let's save that. Let's relaunch our server with Node and let's copy that and send that here. Perfect. Okay, so now that I've done that successfully, oh, is the speaker level fine?
Can you hear me? No. Hey, Professor.
Okay, yeah, turn the volume up some.
Does it just continuously load? Yeah, does it just continuously load? Like how do we make that stop if somebody has like a web page that doesn't have like a server request?
So that was an issue. That was an issue that was happening on server side. So there's nothing I can do from client side to stop that. So what's happening with the HTTP like lifecycle, the response, the request response cycle is that when I go to a URL, I'm sending a request. At least from the initial get-go, I'm doing a GET request that's at that endpoint. And that GET request is just effectively just the default is to get the HTML documents that are there. Well, if it's a directory, if it's a file, then I would try to get that file specifically, like if I did this. But if the server isn't sending back a response, then I'm opening up a connection to that domain name and to that port, and I'm sending in, like I had a callback function, like I have an application that's listening to that port, so I'm not getting a failure to send anything there. But since the response was never sent, I know I'm waiting. I'm just waiting for it to send back the response on my client side, and because of the failure for me to end it here, it never gets sent. So that's what's causing that there. So that's just a problem from the server side. And we can't do anything from my browser. We have to correct it on the server side. But once I did that, once I ended here, response.end, and then whatever data I want to pass into there, then all of a sudden I can do this refresh. Here, let me run my server again. I can refresh this and you can see it's instant, right? There's no loading anymore. I send the request, it sends back the response. This response is hello world. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Does it have like a limit, like a 5-minute limit, if it was just to keep listening for 5 minutes and not get a response?
So that, okay. So those kinds of things could all be up to the way that the browser is configured, right? That's all going to be a client side configuration thing. But a lot of times, that's not necessarily the case. If I just let it sit there, oftentimes the case is I'll just keep waiting for that response to come back.
Oh, so, all right. That's a good warning. Good thing to know about.
Okay. So the next thing I want to do is, well, right now, what we've successfully done is we've built a simple server that takes in requests and sends back responses and actually gives a little bit of data back as a response, not HTML documents. It's just sending raw data that's being rendered by the browser's viewport. But the next thing I want to do is I actually want to launch my application, my server application, using npm instead of node. So right now I'm launching it by invoking node directly, but we could think of npm as kind of our build tool. So we preference using that because our applications are going to get much more complex as we continue on in the semester, and there might be multiple scripts that we have to go ahead and tell to execute. And so we can have a build tool that, first of all, installs all of our dependencies, like external modules that aren't built into Node, and then can even have the ability to start up several different scripts for us. So npm defaults file that's going to look at inside of our directory for all the build information, for all the configuration information about our app, it has to be labeled package.json. So .json is referencing the fact that it's saving all of our configuration data is in the form of a JSON data structure. So it's going to be in the form of like a JavaScript object that is a key value pair. And actually, let's do this. Let me go ahead and create inside of here a package.json, and then package is just the default name. So when we tell npm to start, it's going to look inside of this directory for a file called package.json. It's going to use that as the startup sequence for our application. And again, this is what we would refer to as a build tool if you haven't used a build tool before. So here we will go ahead and so here I'm just creating an object. So some basic things that you typically will always have inside your package.json. You would have a name key, which is the name of your application. You will have a version for your application. This will be version 0.0.1. So this is usually kind of the major release, minor release, and then kind of this particular micro release. So typically versioning is done as a 3-step, but it's up to you. Like the notation isn't necessarily going to be uniform, but this is just a very common way of doing versioning for applications. A description would be a summary, like a English sentence, a natural language sentence of what this application does. Main is going to be the launch point of our application. So the main script to launch when we tell this application to start will be server.js. And then the author would be whatever your name is, right? Like you want to give yourself credit for every application that you build, and you're allowed to do that. Like that's actually something that gets defined inside of the build tool itself. Anyway, so these are the most common things that you'll find when we go ahead and create. And there's tools that actually auto-generate this, but we're going to build it manually so you get comfortable with that. Notice though, when we actually create a .json file, it's very crucial that you use double quotations and not single quotations. Okay, so now that I have this, let me clear this. Oh, I'm still listening. Let's kill that. And let's clear that. Okay, so now that I have that, well, that's it. Now, instead of using node and then server.js, I can just do npm start, and it's going to use this to build my and launch my application. So let's test that out. Let's do npm start, and you see we can then use npm to build out the application. It launches node server.js, the main point here, and then that callback function gets invoked, and we can see our server is now running. So if I go here and refresh my page, I can see, yep, I'm still getting that hello world. So let's go ahead and kill that. So now we've learned how to use npm to build our application. So what's the next thing we want to do? Well, we want to go ahead and, let's say, parse the HTML file name from a URL path of the HTTP request. So our approach here is we're going to learn to use the URL and path modules to parse a request URL path and then to send a file not found error to a client because we don't have any files, we don't have any HTML files to deliver from our web server yet. So let's go and import URL and path. So let me go over here. Nope, let's go into our server. So here I'm going to import the URL module and the path module. And again, just to give you an idea without having to look at the API documents, which you can do in your spare time, just understand that these will give us methods that allows us to parse or to be able to handle both URL and file paths. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is, now that we have these modules imported, we're going to use them so that we can start getting some information from our request object that gets passed into us, so that we can start trying to look internally inside of our not our web server, but inside of our local machine for the file that the client is currently requesting. So that means we're going to refactor our HTTP handler code to parse a request URL object and get the path name from that URL and concatenate the requested path to the current working directory. That's what CWD is going to stand for, to get the current working directory of the server, and then display that to the console. So we're going to update entirely the contents of our HTTP handler here. So instead of just sending this one response, what we're going to do is, from URL, we're going to parse the URL that's inside of the request object. And that's just a value that we get from them. And again, that's going to be what goes in the address bar here. So this will give us, this will parse this into an object itself, so that we can then go ahead and then get properties from it, like the path name of that URL, which is our URI. And then what I want to do is, I'm going to use the path module to be able to concatenate, that's what join's going to do, the current working directory and this URI. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do 2 console logs. I'm going to do the console log on what the URI is, but then I also want to do this console log so you can see what this file name is too. So we can see exactly what's happening here. So we're going to get 2 different printouts when we do this. Excellent. And so now that should be all we need to do to be able to parse, to identify what resource we're trying to, that the client is requesting from us. So let me clear this. Let me run Npm Start and let's test this out. So I'm running here. So now let me see if I can't do this in a way so we could see what's happening in our server down here as well. So if I do a refresh here, you see loading, and just here, the pathway is just a slash. So again, the URI that the resource is looking for, the lookup is the slash. Now on a local machine, if I get the current working directory, it would be this, right? Users, 2022 Web Dev Labs, web server, the project inside of there. So let me go and try this. Let's also do index.html. And here we could say, oh, the URI that I'm trying to request, right, based off of parsing that URL to get a file path, is going to be a file called index.html, where it's going to be inside the root directory of my project. And then by using the working directory, the current working directory, I could see that that file would be right here in my local, inside of my local machine, so that I can actually deliver it to the client. And now, again, notice I'm not sending back a response. So I'm just infinitely loading here. I'm not ending to the client. So my client is not doing anything, but we don't care about the client right now. Like in this particular step, we want to see if we could just parse on the server end what file the client wanted. And once we can do that, we can start thinking about, okay, how can we give that file back as a response? Excellent. So this is exactly what's happening. And look, note, since the request is never resolved from the back end, there was nothing for the browser to display. And so it's just going to perpetually keep loading. And yep, this is exactly kind of the outputs we're getting. We're able to effectively parse either a directory or a file that's being requested. So now the next thing we want to do is, well, since there's no file that exists yet, why don't we respond back with a 404 error to say, oh, there's no file on our server at that pathway, at that domain that you're asking for. So here, our approach is to define a behavior for unsuccessful URL routes in our web server. And we use the file system module to determine if the requested file doesn't exist or not. And if it doesn't exist, then we're going to send a 404 error, file not found. So the first thing we need to do that is, well, we need to import the file system module so that we can start accessing files and directories. So let's go into, let me kill the server here and let me clear that. Okay. So let me go here and I'm going to import the file system module fs. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my HTTP handler and I'm going to refactor that callback function to use the file system to try to sync with a requested file. And so if it exists, it's going to set a stats object into this stats variable. Otherwise, it's going to invoke the helper function file not found. And so note that no files exist on our backend server to serve yet. So at this iteration, the client should always throw the exception. I mean, the server should always throw the exception case for every file name that gets passed into it. So let me go into here and we're going to console log. We're still going to console log everything, but I'm going to get rid of this console log for the file name since we see that. And so I'm going to paste this in here. So here I'm going to just create a variable to hold the stats. I'm going to try to get the stats here. So I'm going to say, I'm going to ask my file system, can it go ahead and sync with this file name? Now, we don't have any file names that are locally in there, so it's always going to throw an exception. And when that exception gets thrown, we're going to invoke this file not found function. Now, we don't have a file not found function yet, but when we do, when we implement it, it's going to have to take in the response object because we're going to use this as a helper function to produce different responses. So this will be the helper function that'll take care of file not found responses. So here, let me just go, I'll do this under my HTTP handler. Here, I'm just going to create a function file not found. It's going to take a response. And to my response, I'm going to write the header 404. That's the status code. And then in terms of the content that has to get written there, that can be passed as a configuration object. That is a key value pair. The content type of our response is going to be as text/plain. So we always have to tell the client what type of content that we're delivering back. And again, that's the MIME type that we're using here. We'll look a little bit more at MIME types in just a moment. And then we're going to write into the response body. So this wrote the header of the response. Then inside the body of the response, we're going to write the text 404 not found and the new line character. And then we're going to end the response so that the client can get this information and end that request. And then we'll just do a simple return statement so that we can go ahead and exit out this block of code. So let me save that. So now that we have this file not found, we should go ahead and be able to launch our application, Npm Start, and actually try to load to index.html, and let's see what happens. So let's do Npm Start. We've launched our server. So now let me go to here. Actually, let's do this so that in the future, perfect. Okay, perfect. Okay, so now let me refresh this. And there I got a 404 not found. I see I was trying to load an index.html. There is no index.html. So it lets me know, it lets the client know, hey, I don't have a file by that name on this server. Excellent. So now let's see if we can't actually respond with a 200 success. Let's see if we can't identify when there is a file that exists on the server. And if it does, say, yeah, it does exist. So here we're going to use the file system module again to determine the requested file exists and then send to 200 if it does. So let's actually create let me do this, touch index.html. Okay. And here we're just going to make an HTML document that has like hello world. And actually, we're going to do a HTML element so that I can ensure I get the appropriate styling too. I don't know, let's do there. Okay, so just H1, a heading 1, hello world. Perfect. So now I have one that exists. And then the next thing I need to do, it's not just being able to have a HTML element that exists on the server. Now I have to start talking about identifying the various MIME types that the browser is requesting. And I do that based off of the extension of the file itself. So here I'm going to define a dictionary that maps each file extension to the content type, to the MIME type. So let me copy this. I'm going to paste it and we'll look at just some of the most popular ones inside of here. So here inside my MIME types, if it is an extension .html, then I know that's going to be text type, and then the specific type is HTML. If it has JPEG, then it's going to be a type of image, and the encoding is going to be JPEG. Same with JPEG and PNG and JS, text, JavaScript, CSS, text, CSS, and these are all different image formats. So again, a well-defined web server would have all these MIME types that it can go ahead and know what the context of the asset or the resource that's supposed to be delivered to the client. And so once we do that, let's go ahead and then refactor our HTTP handler to serve a file if it exists. And then we'll invoke a helper method. So let me go in here. So right here, I'm going to check if stats is a file. So remember, stats is an object. I'll do a console log so we can just see what that looks like here. But okay, from this, since this now is a object that represents the file, I can ask, or the thing that it's synced with. It could ask it, is it a file? Is it a directory? There's a lot of information. We'll see what information's management we do this console log. So, but if it is a file, then we want to invoke our helper function serve file, where we're going to send it that response. Remember, we're always going to send it the response so that we can put what the code is, so we can write a header into it, so that we could write a body if we need to. But we also need to going to send the file name, right, from here that we go ahead and we that we had parsed here using the URL and the path modules, right? We're going to send that to this other method too, so we can use that to try to serve that file to the client. So we're going to send in those two parameters, and this will just be a helper method to help me break my code down across different methods so it doesn't get too lengthy. So what the serve file will do is define a serve file function that configures a response object, and it gets the associated MIME type via the file extension, and it's going to send a response code 200 and the content type that is supposed to be delivered. So we're not going to send the content yet. We're just going to illustrate, hey, we know what type of file you want to open, and we have it. It was a success. So let me go ahead and create this helper function, serve file, takes in those two parameters, response and file name. Here, what I'm going to do is from that path module, I'm going to take that extension name. So one of the cool things about Node is I can ask a path what its extension is, like .html or .css or .js. And I'm going to pass it the file name to be able to get that. So that's going to give me something that is a file extension. It's going to give me whether it's an HTML or JPEG or PNG or JS. Then what I'm going to do is inside my MIME type dictionary, I'm going to pass in the file extension that came from the path that was given to us from the browser, from the client side. And this is going to give me the MIME type, which is going to be the value inside that dictionary. So if it's a .html file, it should give me text/HTML. And so then what I'm going to do inside my response, I'm going to write a 200 success. And then for the configuration here, I got to give it that context of the content type. And the content type is going to be that MIME type that we went ahead and dereferenced. So in this instance, it should be HTML. And then what we'll do is we'll write into the body 200, and then the MIME type was actually found. So we'll actually see what gets rendered into our viewport. And then we have to end that response. So then once we do that, we can go ahead and launch our web server with Npm Start. So let me kill it. Oh, no, not now. Make clear here. And let's do npm start. Excellent. And let me go to my browser and there's the stats object. So you can see the stats object has like the mode and the UID and the block size and the size and all the information that's relevant for this file. And a lot of methods here that's not actually showing you. If you want to see the methods of a stats object, you can just go to the API. But two methods we'll be using is whether this is a file or is this a directory. Now we could see on the browser side when we request index.html that, hey, it was a success. It exists on the server and that it found it as a text/HTML file on our server. So the next thing we probably want to do, since we can actually identify, let me remove that console log here before I forget, so we don't keep getting this printout here. That was right here. Perfect. Okay, so the next thing we probably want to do is, okay, let's open up the contents of that HTML file. Now that we know what the content type is, let's deliver the contents of the file to our client. So here we'll serve the HTML file to the browser. Yep, that's our goal. Our approach is, again, we're going to use that file system module. We're going to use the file system module to read and send HTML files to the browser. So super simple. What I need to do in order to do that is I will have these two lines of code, which I will explain in just a moment, that goes into our serve file method. So let's go to our serve file method. So this was what we were doing before. So instead of writing this, so instead of writing this, like I just writing, I'm going to use the file system to create a read stream. And I'm going to pass it the file name. So this will allow us to actually open up the file and then take the tokens that are inside that file and load them into a stream, like effectively a read stream. And so we'll call this a file stream. So one of the things we can do with this stream is, once we can do with this stream then is we can tell it to pipe all the data from the stream into whatever we pass. So it's going to pipe the information from the left-hand operand of this dot operator, so from the file stream into the response. And so that allows us to funnel all that data from a file through that connection via the response to the client. And again, if we want to kind of read more on that, we could always see, we already did create server here, but I could read more about, well, we learned a little bit about the stats. And so again, on the API, if you want to see more information about is file, is directory, if it's a symbolic link, is it the size, all the different things you can ask of a file, you can go to node.js-file.stats on learn here. And if you want to learn more about streams, which you should be familiar from your Java classes, there's actually a section inside of their learning sequence here where you can learn all about how streams work specifically in Java. Now, obviously, one big thing that you need to do when you have a stream is you have to create a read stream from the file system and pass it a file that you want to create a read stream from. So you need a source. And then you can then use pipe. And then pipe will allow you here, and a great explanation allows you to take the contents of a stream and then send it to some place. And in particular, you want to send that to the response. Excellent. So let's actually test that out and see if it works. Let's kill the server. Let's clear and let's do npm start. And we will do a refresh here and notice. Make sure everything's saved. Oh, I have a dot there, which means I haven't saved it. So let's relaunch and just illustrates you always have to save your files and always relaunch your server whenever you do any testing. So let's refresh there. And there we go. So now we actually got the contents of our index.html file to get passed from the server to the client. And the client goes ahead and renders it as HTML inside of our viewport. So next thing we want to do, which is super common with a web server, because that's effectively what we're building here, is a very bare bone web server, is if you don't explicitly put that you're looking for index.html, if you're just putting the slash, if you're just looking at a directory for a domain name, then the default file that you should look at on your web server is for an index.html and send that to the client. So right now, let's see what happens. If we remove index.html, it doesn't do anything. In fact, let me kill the client here, right? Let me do npm start, and let me do, see, it's trying to load slash, but I don't have a route inside of my source code, right? For just a directory. There's no file to serve that's from just the directory. When I look at my source code and my HTTP handler, when I send in a request with just that route, right, that URI, when I go and tap the file system to try to sync to that file name, it's going to ask, is it a file? And no, it's not a file. And so I'm not doing anything then, right? If it's not a file, I'm just hanging, and that's why I'm just never giving back a response. So what I'm going to do here is on the instance that if what it's asking for is a directory, I want to do a redirect towards index.html. So let's refactor our code then. So what we're going to do that is another status code. We're going to use HTTP code 302, which is a redirect. And we're going to redirect from just a slash request to return a response for a slash index.html. So it can render the index page. And again, if you want to read more about redirections, I have a lot of content right here. MDN has a lot of information about how redirections in HTTP work. And what it'll effectively do is when the response gets a redirect as a response, it'll immediately go ahead and re-request at where it needs to be redirected to. So let's go ahead and refactor our HTTP handler. We need to put in an else if clause. So let's put our else if clause here, right, where we're trying to access this file. So again, whenever you try to access a file, could throw an exception if the file doesn't exist or the directory doesn't exist. And that's when file not found is triggered. If it does, if we do sync to something, then it's either a file or it's a directory, right? If we successfully sync, it's either one of those two things. If it's a file, right, so we can query it, and if this is true, then we're going to tell it to serve file, in which case we'll send the response object and the file name to be part of that resolution. Otherwise, if it's a directory, we're gonna invoke this new helper function, serve index, and we're going to pass it that response. Again, we got to pass it the response so that we can fill it out and send it back to the client. So let's see what serve response is going to do. So it's going to, let's fill this in here. So serve index, which is going to be the name of the helper method in the instance that the file name is a directory type. We are going to take in the response, and to the response, we're going to write a header of 302. That's the status code that causes a redirect. And then we have to supply as a parameter the location that's going to be redirected to. So it's going to be index.html. This is a key value pair. And then we're going to end that response so that we can actually go ahead and terminate that connection with the client. Because look, I'm just sitting here talking to you in the background. It's just sitting there still spinning. And then we can test that out. We can go ahead and launch npm start. Let's go ahead and kill this. Let's clear the terminal. Let's do npm start. Okay, and let's see if, you saw it right there. So I tried without index.html. It did a loading here, right, from the server. And then I got that 302 response, which caused a redirect to go look at index.html, and then it loaded index.html right there. So that's a good example of, yep. And so there we go. We do redirects. And again, if a file doesn't exist, let's do like error.html, right? I get loading HTML for not found. Yeah, this is starting to feel more like a good basic web server. Let's go back. Okay, perfect. So the last thing we need to do here, though, is on the instance that it isn't a client error, and so far the client error is when we request a resource that doesn't exist on a server. That was a 404. And if it's not a success, that was a 200 that we saw, right? That's when we successfully requested a file that exists, so it's able to complete our request. And if it's not a 302, that's a redirect, right? So that's like we requested the contents at the directory, and so we redirect towards the index.html of that directory, right? So we looked at all those, but there's one last status code, 500, that represents some internal server error. And so 500 is probably the most popular server-side error status code you're going to get, which is just like the generic error code. If you can't find, say, for instance, the file or the directory, but it exists. Like, so if you don't have like read permissions on it, or the file's corrupted, or if for some reason there's an error that occurs in even the logic of accessing it, you might get this 500 internal server error code. And we'll actually see how we could trigger that, for instance. So let me go ahead here and add this else clause in here. So if the requested, so effectively what I want to do, just one pretty simple, well, I think 2 steps, but the first, what we want to do is inside this if else is we want to check if the stats exist. Then if it's a file, we're going to serve the file. If it's a directory, then we're going to serve the index. Now, if it's not a file and if it's not a directory, then something is weird, right? So we're just going to then say, oh, well, let it know that it's a server error. And for some reason, we don't have like permission to access or read that file, or that file is corrupt and we can't pipe it the way we need to. So this will just be the default else clause that we'll put in here just to handle whatever edge case might occur. And usually that's going to be because of an error on our part in our logic for accessing something. So here we're going to go ahead and invoke the server error function and send it the response so that we can write the response out and send back to the client. Here, the server error response is just going to be, we write the head status code 500. The content type will just be text plain, just like with our 404 error here. And we will then write to the body of the response, oh, this was a 500 internal error. And then we will send that response back to the user. And so if we wanted to test this out, we have to break, in order to test this, there's nothing we can do to test this, because well, there is, we have to break our server logic. Because ultimately, if we want to test 404s, we look for files that don't exist on our web server. When we test 200s, we ask for files that do. If we want to get 302s, we ask from the directory perspective. But the only way a 500 triggers is if something goes wrong on the server side. So to ensure that, let's break our code, right, to test this out. So to actually test this, let's go into our HTTP handler. And instead of having this condition that if stats is a file, I'm going to accidentally put a not there, right? So again, you don't want to do this. I'm doing this as testing purposes. I'm actually breaking my code to force a 500 to occur. So when I make a lock, I'm going to check the condition of is file. And if it's true, I want to serve file. But I'm going to say, if it's not a file, I'm going to serve the file, right? That's an error in logic. So, and then if it is a file, we know it's not going to be a directory then, because it's either a file or a directory. So that's going to cause the else clause to trigger, and that'll give us the ability to test our 500 status code. So let's launch our server with Npm Start. Let me refresh my page, and there you see 500 internal error. Now, if my code is written like correctly, I shouldn't get that. And in fact, you never want to get that, but you have it there as the ability to be kind of your generic tell to the client that, hey, something went wrong on the server side, and there's some internal error that's preventing us from doing something, from producing a response for you. And it's nothing that you did. It's nothing that happened on the client side. It's an issue on the server side. So let me get that running again. And okay, I can open it back up once I correct that logic. Excellent. And that's pretty much it. We use Node, just bare bones Node and NPM and the core modules of Node to effectively build a very bare bone web server. But now you can understand some of the considerations that goes into listening for requests and sending back a response to the client, and what information you need to get from the request, typically the MIME types, and what you always have to tell back to your client, like what the status code is and what the MIME type of the document that you're going to return back is. And then if it is a document, being able to, actually access the file system, open it up and pipe that into the response so it can be fed into the client, and the client can then use that and render it into the viewport. So next time we'll actually do something very similar, but we'll use Express, and you're going to see what Express does for us. It takes care of managing all these considerations about setting up a web application that's going to have a lot of endpoints, because you can see building up endpoints this way by hand would be very difficult. It would be very arduous. Express allows us to expressly build out these endpoints and bind callback functions to them and manage all of the middle work of taking in these requests and sending back a response, so that we can focus more on our app logic and less on this request response logic. Excellent. So is there any questions about today's lab? So just some final comments. In this lab, you learned to implement a basic web server in Node that responds to HTTP requests and serves HTML files to the web browser. The web server supports 404, 200, 302, and 500 status codes. And in this lab, you learned about HTTP routes, about MIME types, and HTTP code. So all the considerations that go into responses as opposed to requests, which we've spent the last 2 labs learning about. So again, our future improvements would be to use Express to deploy a more complex web server using less code. So we do fancier things, and it's actually easier for us. Excellent. So if there's no questions, I'm actually done today. So I can actually go ahead and we can actually leave a little bit earlier than we traditionally do. Excellent. Let me go ahead and end our video then. Stop the recording.